Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk here, and to Sima for involving me in the project from the beginning, as well as to Claudia for extending the invitation to me here at the ICI. So we've heard this argument and counter-argument. We're in the land of Hegel, after all, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to provide some sort of a synthesis, but this is not what's going to happen here. The title of my remarks is Art's Articulations, and it is a kind of postscriptum to the text that I wrote for Sima's collection. I will share with you what I think is an alternative, a kind of bastard genealogy of art as a term, because usually we associate art with artificiality as opposed to a certain naturalness. And in this, we are quite faithful to the Aristotelian gesture of separating techne from physis, right? Techne as a generic form for art, for anything that is manufactured, as opposed to physis, the word that in Latin became natura, or nature, as something that is self-generated and self-produced. So what Sima is doing is she's showing us a kind of cross-contamination of what would be techne and physis for Aristotle. But I want to take this very notion of art in a slightly different direction. One hint concerning the non-anthropocentric nature and practice of art is etched right on the surface, the semantic one that is, in the word itself. Whatever it does, art is an articulation. But what does articulation do? What does it really imply? Articulation is a beautiful word that conjoins two seemingly disparate senses located on the different sides of the barricades in the Cartesian universe. It names both a spatial jointure, you articulate things by putting them together, assembling things in space, and an illocutionary act, creating meaning by way of expressing the world in words. So I'm articulating my talk now, right? That is to say, this word brings together extension and intention, the real and the ideal, or the ideational. Often called articulations or articular surfaces, the joints in our bodies are the structural connections between the bones that afford us a whole range of movements. At the most concrete level, freedom of movement is indebted to the range of possibilities the joints, or the articuli, open within determinate anatomical constraints. An articulate person, in turn, is one who speaks fluently and coherently with a high degree of eloquence and persuasion and precision. Such a person is particularly adept at putting words and ideas together, stringing them into meaningful sequences. So we could map the entire mind-body split, this infamous mind-body split, the division between the thinking thing, res cogitans, and the extended thing, res extensa, onto the different semantic inflections of articulation. But as soon as we were to engage in such a cartographic endeavor, we would realize that the division is still a rift within the same. And we should perhaps give Descartes a little more credit than we tend to. He must have known that the two share their rootstock, which is why we find the same substantive, res, thing, on both sides of the Cartesian abyss. So even though res cogitans and res extensa are two completely separate substances, they are nonetheless res, each of them. Already from this brief overview, it is clear that articulation does what it says, namely it articulates, gathers and puts in touch diverse elements, including various senses of articulation itself. Now, it does so without canceling out their differences or assimilating them to a greater whole. If they were fused with one another, the bones actually separated and brought together by the joints would no longer allow for the mobility of the skeletal structures they are part of. Likewise, words melded into a seamless unity would not amount to an articulate narrative, but to a more or less meaningless collections of sounds, or maybe even to one sound, undifferentiated. Articulations, then, are always broken, and it is their breaks, the sites of discontinuous continuities, that breathe with the promise of freedom. In his writings, Jacques Derrida chanced upon a similar insight. But as always, a little averse to organic figures and images, he preferred the manufactured object to serve as the model of articulation, the hinge, la brisure. From there, deconstructive dynamics take off in a flash, showing how self-contradictions do not invalidate, but rather instigate the operations of hinges that work only thanks to a certain unhinging, a breaking open and a coming undone. Of course, articulation is also inconceivable without some degree of disarticulation, preserving, as we have seen, the differences among the articulated elements. It is a state of connectedness in separation, the nuance that is all too often lost on us in the era of globalization, global integration, and network creation. What interests me, though, is that historically the meaning of articulation has itself been disarticulated, discombobulated, in such a way that one of its aspects received a more positive valuation than the other. Speech production and sense-making prevailed over spatial assemblages. And it was not at all clear that spatial assemblages could themselves be sites of meaning. And I think this is what Sima's work also highlights for us. And this asymmetry that I'm pointing toward here was highly consequential for the default understanding of art. My hunch is that regardless of its content, theme, subject matter, or genre, art distills the articulations and disarticulations of the world from the world in the two senses of articulation I mentioned, spatial and expressive. It teases out the processes of fitting together and drawing apart that make the world what it is, a complex assemblage where synthetic and analytic activities are physical and embodied before they are sublimated into moments of human perception and cognition, which we identify with thinking in toto. But in fact, that spatiality itself is already an articulation in an expressive sense. Art as an articulation renders a human artist superfluous because entities are articulated. Indeed, they articulate themselves and join other entities all by themselves. Heidegger's interpretation of the world as a totality of things, already imbued with hermeneutical sense, and Benjamin's notion of the language of things testify to this superfluity. Not to be outstripped, philosophers in the Western tradition have tried to remedy the situation, in fact, to recenter the human artist by emphasizing symbolic over spatial articulations in art. Conventionally understood, the hierarchy of the arts, passed down from Aristotle to Hegel, stretches from the lowly material kinds, such as architecture, to the highest ideal varieties, such as music and poetry. But it is not only materiality and ideality that are at stake here, or better, these philosophical labels are at stake only as codifying the two senses of articulation. I would suggest that the very notions of materiality and ideality are derivative with regard to the two senses of articulation. Architecture belongs at the bottom of the hierarchy because it deals with the articulation of things in space, if not with the articulation of space, while music and poetry are high up on the ladder of the arts because they are concerned with the articulation of sounds and in sounds, and therefore in time, as opposed to space. The usual temptation in the face of such hierarchies is to invert them, to place them head down. This would entail privileging matter over spirit, space over time, touch over sound. We would do well to remember, though, that the convulsions of art and articulation are immanent to the same word, to the same thing that presents itself to us in two seemingly incompatible manners. Instead of reinventing the hierarchical head, one must chop it off to come up with an acephalic, I would say vegetal configuration. Articulation sustains this more radical effort. It permits us to ask, on the one hand, how things speak without words, express themselves wordlessly, seeing that the arrangement and distribution of phenomena in space is a mode of their expression, and, on the other hand, how speaking things, given that words and sounds are already resonances with the places where they're emitted, with air and other than human beings. And, of course, if we enlarge that to written language, to inscription, that is an even more obviously spatial figure of expression. It follows that articulation is a tool for imagining, bringing about, or simply discovering art without humans. Nevertheless, this without is far from uncomplicated. As I write in my contribution to Reading by Osmosis, and I quote, "Reading planetary metabolism of human participation in the present does not exclude either the past or the future of human involvement. For all intents and purposes, in the geological era known as the Anthropocene, the hand and the work of the human, anthropos, is a constant background overshadowing every possible occurrence, contact, and chance encounter. Our withdrawal from the world at present will not pave the way to an independent work and play of the world, indifferently pursuing its metabolic courses without us. The fantasies of an environmental ideal that would ensue after the last human is gone are just that, mere fantasies." And so to state this in slightly different terms, exceptionally disarticulating, if not destructive, not only destructive, but devastating articulations attributable to the human or to a segment of humanity, it hardly matters, will keep steering in a more or less clandestine fashion the art of the world itself. Now, since I've already mentioned my take on art as a planetary metabolism, an objection might crop up in your minds. Isn't art as articulation the exact opposite of art as metabolism? Is he betting, you might ask, on synthesis in the one case and on analysis on the other, in the other case? My response would be that art is both articulation and metabolism, and moreover, that metabolism articulates, while articulation also metabolizes. That is why art is not a machine for translating, signifying or resignifying, marking or remarking, scaling down the world to humanly manageable, graspable, or at least expressible terms. In the process whereby art distills the articulations and disarticulations of the world from the world, there is precisely a digestive analysis, hence a moment of metabolism. Art is a perverse articulation, and the perversion in question pertains not only to the world it betrays, and I note parenthetically, at least in English, that expression is one of the more positive connotations of betrayal. It pertains not only to the world it betrays, but also, and in the first instance, to the mutual contamination and intermingling of the two senses of articulation. So, to conclude, the mere act of identifying an object as a work of art, be it as a ready-made or, I dare say, a ready-found, in the case of Reading by Osmosis, begins to metabolize that object, to transpose it onto the symbolic realm, and I think this is what Dan was pointing toward. But this transposition is never complete. The extensive physical jointures of objects, contexts, and indeed words, irreducible to the intensive and intentional regime of articulation. Within art itself, in the narrow and the broad senses of the term, the two modes of articulation keep changing places, playfully passing into one another, only to diverge before yet another convergence. Much of the explosive force and power in art hinges on its capacity to transcribe the spatial into the expressive and vice versa, to transcribe without ever giving us an adequate translation. In a word, to articulate. Thank you.
Thanks.